Well, good morning. Happy Easter. It's always kind of a weird thing on this weekend because this is one of those weekends that literally millions of people around this planet will celebrate death, in particular death. And you are here today to sort of celebrate that death. Some of you, this is your church and you come here every week, and this is part of sort of the cycle of your life, that Easter weekend, to be reminded again in a very real and specific way of what Jesus has done for us. Some of you are here because this, you come a couple of times a year, and this is the time to kind of come and maybe see if there's still some spark between you and God. And some of you are here because you came to visit your family, and your family came here today, or your girlfriend came here today, and so you're here as well. And but for all of us, no matter where we find ourselves, for all of us, we have to come to grips with this whole idea of death and hope in death. You think of the news this week. I was thinking about it. We've had the big news of the terrible tragedy in Belgium. But at the same time, we have terrible tragedies like that happening around the globe almost every day. You know that more people died in Baghdad this last week than did in Belgium? Same kind of thing. One gets news, one doesn't, but still both terrible kind of situations. And while we can sort of mourn with them, there is also a distance that happens between us because they're in a different continent, different place. But I was reminded a little bit more about death this week. Personally, Thursday I was up in Colombia getting some supplies to finish up for Easter, and there was a terrible, terrible wreck at 175 and 108 where they kind of crossed there. And any of you got trapped in there on Thursday? Anybody else? Yeah, I mean, it was crazy, right? I was there for 3 hours. I stopped and I thought, I'll eat lunch while I'm waiting, and it'll be cleared out. I mean, it was still going after that, and the parking lot was a parking lot literally around all that stuff. And you could tell it was a bad accident, and then later to find out that at least 2 people lost their life on Thursday here close to us. Then Friday morning, when I was just waking up, Lori asked me if I'd seen a message on Facebook for about a family we've been praying for. A grandson of a good friend of mine had been battling for 2 weeks. They discovered that he'd had a stroke, 6 years old. Had this thing called a pediatric stroke. I never heard of him before. And to find out that on Friday morning, early in the morning, that he breathed his last breath in his arms of his parents. And death seems to be all around us. Seems to pervade life at times. And death on a weekend like this is about hope because somebody came back to life, which is incredible. I don't know about you, I've never seen somebody come back to life. But to have that story, and have it be more than a story, but a reality, can give us hope in those times when death seems to squeeze closer and closer and closer to us. And we're wrapping up a series today called Rethinking How We Think About the End. Because for a lot of us who grew up in Christian surroundings, the whole end-time scenario involves a lot of death, right? This idea of people dying and people dying for their faith and people dying because Jesus returns, and it just sort of pervades all that stuff. And we've been looking at a particular passage, Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25. And it's all based on this question that the disciples asked Jesus, found over in Matthew 24. As they're leaving this glorious temple, the center for Jewish faith here on this planet was the temple. It's where they came and they met with God, and so many sacrifices happened. And as they're leaving the temple, Jesus' disciple says to him, "Man, look at this place. Isn't this place great? I mean, it's impressive." And it wasn't even all the way finished yet. It was going to take another 30 years plus after Jesus is at that spot that day to finish it. But it was already been getting constructed for a lot of years already. And it was a gorgeous sight. And the disciples say, Jesus, look at this. Isn't this amazing? And to which Jesus says, guys, I hate to tell you this, as great as this is, it's actually going to all get torn down. And these were huge stones. Be tossed around like Legos, which they didn't have Legos back then, but I say that because you would understand what Legos look like tossed around, right? To which the disciples asked this question. Tell us, Jesus, when? When will that happen? And what sign will signal your return in the end of the world? Because they couldn't imagine the temple being torn down without Jesus coming back. In reality, we know that there are two events because the temple was torn down about 40 years later in these folks' life. And for us, we know Jesus has not come back yet. And Jesus begins his explanation to them, which is a very kind of convoluted, unclear explanation this way. Don't let anyone mislead you. Which ought to tell us right at the very beginning that it will be easy to be misled. And that's why we've been rethinking what we think about the end, because I think at times we've been misled of what we think is going to happen or what the focus of this whole thing is. So today as we wrap this all up, I want to talk to you just about this whole idea of watching that Jesus talks about. And watching in light of what this weekend represents. But before we go any farther, I want to invite you to bow your heads and let's pray one more time together, okay? Father, in this room right now are people who have lost loved ones, people that have been close to them in death, some of them very recently. And for those of us that haven't lost somebody recently, a lot of us have had significant people in our lives die, and we have felt that loss. But the reality is, every day, there are literally thousands of people who that experience is fresh and new. Even as we sit here in this comfortable place this morning, somebody somewhere has passed away already. Somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's father. And death just seems to be all around us. And at times we experience in our life and death of not necessarily somebody that we love and care about, but death of things in our own lives. Hopes and dreams and relationships. But I just ask today as we gather some information, that the information would do more than just give us stuff to know, but that it would drive us back to you as the only hope we have of making it off this planet in one piece. So we ask for your presence to be here today and to speak to us again in your name. Amen. All right, back over Matthew chapter 24. I want to just pick up the statements when Jesus talks about this idea of watching, because if you're familiar with sort of the idea that a lot of people have about the end times, it's about watching and watching for different signs and different elements. And some of you have probably known people, have heard people, have maybe even seen their research, their charts, their diagrams about the end times. How many of you ever seen somebody have that kind of stuff? A few of you, all right, yeah, you know. This whole idea of what's going to happen, and they got it all mapped out because they know exactly when this is going to happen, when that's going to happen, because if I know all those things, then I'm not going to be caught off guard. And we're going to see how valuable and how real that is. But let's just listen to what Jesus had to say about this idea of watching. One of the times he says, listen, watch out that no one deceives you. So we ought to be aware that nobody deceives us. Therefore, keep watch because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. So kind of this idea of staying on your toes because you don't know if now, maybe later. Now, so watch out. Or if you're the owner of the house, had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. In other words, if you knew somebody was going to come to your house tonight at 1 o'clock in the morning and steal something, you would be waiting for them, right? Because you don't want them to steal your stuff. And so he says, if the guy knew, he would watch out for that. Keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. And that's another one of those things. You don't keep watch because you don't know when. And the question has to be, Well, the main question is this. How do we watch? What does watching look like according to all these stories that Jesus tells? And Jesus tells a ton of stories in this passage when he's talking to his disciples. He talks about things happening in the world around us, about wars, about famines, about earthquakes, about some terrible stuff that happens. And he says, oh, by the way, don't get too worked up over that because that's just how things happen around here. And he'll talk about situations, of persecution and even people getting killed for their faith. And he goes on about all these different kind of things. And then he goes on to these stories, a bunch of different stories. And all of them have this theme of the idea of watching and what watching looks like. How do we watch is the question there. And the answer for a lot of people over history has been you watch by keeping charts, marking off the things. We have wars and rumors of wars. Check, right? We have famines in all sorts of places. Check. We have earthquakes. In fact, did you know that we had more earthquakes this last year than ever in the history of the world? Which I'm not sure how we really know that because we can only go back so far in the history of the world because we don't have little signs. But no. Check. And I get it checked off and I get it charted off and I say, this is a sign, I put it here. And the problem is, every 10 or 15 years, you've got to change some of your signs because what you thought was a sign isn't working right now. World War I, erase. World War II, erase. Korea, Vietnam, erase. Right now, you may have even seen one of the popular books out right now is about figuring out how this whole kind of radical Islam fits into the Bible. Where is it at in the Bible so we can say this is a sign of the end? Which has been really kind of hard to find. But it hasn't prevented people from writing some books and selling some books. Because everybody wants to get some inside information because that's how you watch. You watch by being aware and marking things down, writing stuff down. We've seen it. I saw it on Highway 29 yesterday. Sign over the road signs that flash up the Amber Alerts and stuff. The Amber said, what's it say? See something, report something. What's it say? See something, say something. See, it got in your mind, right? And that's how you watch. You see something, you say something. It makes sense. But let's look and see what Jesus talks about when he talks about the answer to this. So here's the watching data, and we're going to run through this real quick. You can read it later for yourself, Matthew 24 and 25, but we're just going to kind of run through it. The first one he talks about is nature. And he talks about this idea of a fig tree. And he basically says, listen, at this time of the year, in the time we're at right now, you go out and see a tree and it begins to get little green leaves on it, right? Some little bitty green leaves. Maybe the cherry blossoms are getting close, right? And you know that what's going to happen? This is not a hard question, folks. Tree gets a little bit of stuff on it. Thank you, Jennifer, yeah. These are not hard questions, folks, all right? But spring's coming, right? So Jesus says, here's the watching data from nature is, watching means awareness. You see this? He says, then no. When you begin to see these things, you know what's going to happen. So he kind of plays into this idea of looking around and watching these events. Next to watching data, history. And he talks about Noah. And his way he talks about Noah is he says, listen, it's going to be just like when Noah was here. Life went on as usual. And so watching means recognizing the numbing of life. That life just happens. And for a lot of us, that's a great description of our life, isn't it? We are so busy just living life that we really have failed to make much of a life. Because we just don't have time. We got to be here, we got to be there. So Jesus says that we're watching is just recognize this numbness of life, that it just kind of happens. Another part of the data is crime. That one about the thief. That if you knew the thief was going to show up, you'd be there with your Rottweiler, right? And your gun. Or maybe call the cops if you're smarter. But watching means preparing for the bad, being vigilant about it, but recognizing bad could happen. Because remember, when he tells the story, it's an after-the-fact story, right? He says if the homeowner had known that the thief was going to show up, he would have been ready for him, but apparently he didn't know, so he wasn't ready. So watching means being prepared for the bad. There's the watching data of work. And Jesus' story is simply this. What's a good servant look like? If I say, hey, I'm leaving for a while, I'm going to be gone, take care of business, Grace. And the question is, did Grace take care of business while I was gone? Is she a good or bad servant? Is she a good or bad employee? And watching means being responsible in that context. Because if he comes back and everything's good, then everything's good. But if he comes back and finds out Grace has been goofing off, she's been living it up, then things aren't going to be so good. So watching means this idea of being responsible in this waiting time. There's the wedding. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. These 10 bridesmaids. There's 5 that are smart, 5 that aren't very bright. Kind of these clueless girls. And you remember the story? The big takeaway from that was, everybody falls asleep, right? So watching doesn't mean necessarily staying awake. Watching means being ready for whatever, because in their case, the delay made all the difference. The other one was resources. Jesus tells the story of talents, this idea of money. How this master gives, one guy $5,000, another guy $2,000, another guy $1,000, and he takes off on a trip, and he says, take care of business while I'm gone. When he gets back, the one that's, had $5,000 has expanded the money. Which you're, for boss, you're thrilled. The guy's done a great job. He doubled your business. The guy with $2,000 has doubled the business. The guy with $1,000 said, oh, man, I was afraid that you were going to be tough when I got back, so I just kind of put it underneath the mattress, because that's a safe place. So when you got back, you had everything you started with. To which, if you remember the story, Jesus says, the owner, the master says, you wicked, lazy servant. You should have done something. At least you could have put in the bank and got 0.32% interest, but it would have been something as opposed to nothing. Yeah, I got my money back, but you didn't do anything. And so in that category, watching is about not living cautiously, which tends to be the draw of a lot of our lives. I'm just trying to get it through. I'm not trying to take any risk. In fact, I'm trying to cut down on those risks, right? Which brings us to the last watching data, the one we looked at last week, this idea of living, the idea of sheep and goats. And the takeaway last week was this idea is watching is about who we've become. And so how do we watch? We watch in a whole lot of ways. And it's not just simply charting and diagramming. It's not just simply watching for certain kinds of events. It's not even, don't miss this, it's not even making sure that I've done everything possible in my life so I make sure I am saved, that I'm okay, that I'm ready for when Jesus comes. Because when all we care about is making sure when I'm ready for Jesus comes, me, we have missed the whole point of salvation. Because it has nothing to do with you. Turn to your neighbor and say, it has nothing to do with you. Somebody that's going to feel good saying, it has nothing to do with you. Because it doesn't. Because when we make it about me and about us, I got to make sure I'm ready, I'm saved, then we miss the whole point of salvation. It's about others. That's what the sheep and the goats discovered. Remember, the great takeaway was everybody's surprised. It wasn't about going and making sure we're taking care of the poor and the hungry and the folks in prison and having this ministry and that ministry. It is simply about these people who've become people, who've cared about the people around them. And for me, the takeaway that Jesus is talking about here is simply this: to live in the expectancy that Jesus is coming without getting overly worked up over that reality. That's all I got, folks. That's it. To live in the expectancy that Jesus is coming. Because sometimes some of our weeks remind us how much we long for him to come. Because there's this belief we share, and I think it's a valid biblical belief, that when he shows up, while it'll be bad for some people, it'll be really good for a lot of people, and that life will literally change forever. And that at some point, after he returns and we come back to this planet, there's this great promise that there's no more pain, no more death, No more crying. No more sadness. Any of those things sound like good things for you? Remember, they're on the other side is when he talks about that. Jerry had me down at WGTS this week, and we were talking about our Easter program this week, and thanks again, Jerry, for putting the shout out for us on that. But one of the questions Blanca asked me was about this idea of right after, it was that morning, same morning that this whole thing in Brussels had happened, and kind of the question, how do we sort of feel good about, how do we help people feel good about, not feel threatened about all that? And I think the thing I basically said was, I don't think that's the goal. You know, our goal is to feel safe. But is that really God's goal for us? I mean, the reason I believe that we have emotions is because emotions tend to move us. And if we numb those things, most of us, I mean, our whole society, our whole culture is built on numbing those emotions that we don't like. Nobody wants to feel sad, so you figure out a way to numb the sadness. Nobody wants to feel lonely, so you figure out a way to numb the loneliness. Nobody wants to feel frustrated or angry, so we figure out ways to numb all that stuff. But what if those emotions were designed by God to come into our life in order to move us, to change us, to make us do something that we wouldn't do unless we felt those emotions? And in my mind, that's this idea of living expectancy that Jesus is coming. Those emotions of hope for that, hopings for longings for that, and the frustration that we have no clue when that event's going to happen. And do not let the weight so discourage us from the hope, so that we don't get overly worked up over that reality, that we don't get caught up in what Pastor Randy Roberts and Loma Linda talks about, these days of adrenaline emotions. And if you've been around churches for very much of your life, you know there's those days of adrenaline, right? Some sign happens, and we know for sure Jesus is coming. You got to get out and tell your neighbors because Jesus is coming. Everybody gets excited, and then nothing happens. And some of you have lived long enough to go through enough of those stories and enough of those experiences. It's like that children's story about the boy that goes up, he watches the sheep out in the field outside of town, and he's bored. Because apparently watching sheep is pretty boring. So he decides to stir up the action. You probably remember this story. And he begins to yell at the top of his lungs. Remember what he yells out? Wolf, wolf! And everybody in town rushes up there because if the wolf has shown up, it's going to eat the sheep. That'll ruin the town because this is one of their cash crops. And so everybody runs up, to which the boy has a great laugh because this is funny to see all these old people. I mean, you can imagine certain old people that you know running would be really funny, you know. So he laughs, he laughs at a great time. And they get pretty ticked off at him, right? Because you should never yell wolf unless you really mean it. So they go back to town, life goes on. He gets a little bored again, decides to have a little bit more fun. Wolf, wolf, everybody comes running back up. He laughs again. They yell at him again. And of course, you know the punchline of the story. He's up there one day and actually sees a wolf. Which after playing the game a couple times has to be a little, whoa, what do I do now? Because here's a wolf, I haven't seen one before. So he yells, wolf, wolf, and nobody shows up. Finally, they decide, he hasn't come back tonight. He's been out there really late. Where's he at? So they go to find him. They find him crying. And remember they say to him, well, here's the problem. You kept crying, wolf, wolf. Kept me excited when there was no reason to get him excited. And the punchline is that nobody believes a liar, even when they're telling the truth. And I think at times, in our desire to pin down when Jesus is coming, we've turned ourselves into liars. And we confirmed in some other people's minds the truth that we are way off base. Ed Stetzer's a Christian researcher and author. He says at some point in our life, each of us has to learn the necessity of taking the long view. We do it in education. Some of you are going to school right now, and you're going to school right now so that you have more opportunities once you graduate. Some of you are putting away money now. You're putting away money now so that at some point in the future, maybe a really long future, you'll have some financial security, right? Some of you are starting to take better care of your health, not because, you want to get ready for summer, though that's a great benefit, but maybe it's not enough time for you to get ready for summer. But you're investing now so that later it will pay off, that your health is better. The reality is deferred gratification causes us to live differently. It causes us to live differently in life, and it causes us to live differently in how we approach life. Because how we see this delay, and remember this is one of Jesus' whole stories throughout this whole section, is the delay changes everything for everybody. A lot of the stories are about that. That Jesus doesn't show up, the master doesn't show up when he was expected. He's a long time, it says. And when things are delayed in our life, all of us have a tendency to do one of two things. We either get really frustrated. How many of you ever enjoyed waiting for the cable company? Anybody? Right? We get frustrated. It'd be between these hours. It's like, how hard can it be to pin down between 4 hours? You can't, so you get frustrated, right? Or you just kind of get tired of the whole idea of waiting and you just kind of say, forget it. I'll let them worry about it when it happens. So here's the reality. Reality about information about the whole return of Jesus and the end of times. Information can guide us. It's beneficial that way. It can give us some part of the roadmap. We talked about that the first week. Not so much about distance, but about direction. And that's what information can do. It can guide us. It can also inform us. And that's important. It's important to have information. Information is not bad. It can be good. But here's the reality with information. It cannot of itself save us. And when we put too much faith in our idea of information, we have been clear historically that what we have thought was accurate information has not always been accurate information. Not because of the problem with information, but the problem with how we've interpreted the information. See, to diagram the times is to miss the point. Because Jesus is clear through all these stories. You have no clue when I'm going to show up. I don't even have a clue when I'm going to show up. You don't know the day and hour. And as I told you a couple weeks ago, that does not mean you can know the month and year. But he says you have no idea when this is going to happen. And to diagram the times is to miss the point, because when you think about the times, diagram times, you're thinking about the future and you're trying to get it all mapped out. And the reality is, it is not about then, it is about now. You look at all of Jesus' stories about this. Sure, he's talking about things that are going to happen, but his more important thing is, what are you doing now? The 10 virgins, what are they doing now? That's going to pay off then. The good or bad employee, what are they doing in the meantime? Not when he returns. The sheep and the goats, the talents, all those things are about what are they doing now as opposed to then. Because the reality is then will happen, but now is happening. And one of the saddest things I've seen over the course of my years as a pastor and as a Christian is to see people who are so wrapped up in the end times that they're not living today for now's time. Because they're getting ready for that event and they've got it figured out. And doesn't Jesus care more about what you're going through today than about some plan that's set up for then? See, when we need a threat or even a presence to do right, we are doing right for the wrong reason. So often that's been the push of the idea of end times. Let's scare people into it. Let's threaten them, and so they do the right thing. Or let's give them the sense of your presence. Now, let's be honest. I'm a parent. I raised 2 boys. A number of you are parents. Some of you will be parents at some point. And let's be honest. We want our kids to do right. Right, John? We want them to do right. And especially when you're in the room, you want them to do right, right? Yeah. But beyond that, a parent recognizes that ultimately what they want is their kid to do right, not because of their presence or some kind of threat, even though those things do seem to work, all right, a little bit. But ultimately you want your child to do right because it's right. Because they have believed that this is the right thing to do as opposed to simply a threat or because of your presence, they're doing those right things. It's the payoff that we all long for. See, Jesus' return is about redemption. Redemption means getting something back. It's making a good story out of a hopeless one. And I think the end is not about knowing when he's going to show up. It's not about knowing the signs of his return, because he's pretty clear. These things don't really, they're sort of direction things. They're not about distance things. But his return is all about each of us experiencing this idea of redemption in our own lives. It's about the reality of God making a good story out of a hopeless one. And the problem with most of us is we believe one or two things about our story. We either think our story is hopeless, that we have done way too much bad stuff, we have messed up too much stuff, we have screwed up too much stuff, we have made too many bad choices. There's literally no hope for us because we can't imagine God living with us because we can't live with ourselves. And so we find ourselves there, or we find ourselves in total opposite camp where we think, I'm not so bad. My story's not really hopeless. Sure, it's got a few kinks here and there, but there's always, there's a little room for improvement, but it's not that bad. And the reality is, everybody sitting in this room, everybody living on this planet is hopeless without Jesus. No matter how you feel about yourself. But with Jesus, you can be the most hopeful person. Because no matter what your story is, your story can be and should be a story of redemption. Your past should not be something you want to kind of forget. Your past ought to be a testament to just how far God has and can and is bringing you. Because it's not about your life necessarily becoming better and better and you becoming gooder and gooder, and I know that's terrible English. It's about recognizing that what this weekend is all about is true. That God himself came down to this planet. That he experienced the things we experienced. In fact, he experienced more things than some of us will ever have to experience. And he did it willingly because he wanted us to know and get a better picture of what God is like than we've ever had before. Something more than just what's written in the pages of our Bible. Something more than the stories that have been passed down about this is how God looks at you. He wants us to know that when we see him, we've seen the Father. A Father who's willing to come down, be with us, die for us, and die not just in the sense of dying, but die in the sense of bearing the weight of all the stuff, all of our stuff, Letting the stuff that at times feels like it's going to crush our life literally crush his life. And then to come back to life. To let us know that there is power. There is power in what God can and is doing in your life. Jonathan Dodson, a blogger, wrote this. The gospel is the good and true story that Jesus has defeated sin, death, and evil through his own death and resurrection, is making all things new, even us. And I love those last two words. Because while God is making all things new, sometimes it's easy to look at our own lives and think, I don't see the newness there. The reality is sometimes some of us take a little bit longer to get restored. I grew up around cars and drag racing and restoring cars, and some restorations are pretty easy, Pete, and some restorations are really, really tough. My brother still does a lot of that stuff, and sometimes they literally put like 3 or 4 cars together to get one car because they're so bad, so much rust is in. But the reality is the ultimate goal is to get them back into showroom condition. Nothing better, nothing worse. And you know what the hardest job in restoration is? Well, one of the hardest jobs. And that is making sure the car is not better than it was when it came off the factory. Because it's so easy to say, I would have done this differently, I would have painted this differently, I would have. The reality is when they came off the line, there were marks and stuff on them. And that's God's goal for all of our lives. To remind us again that he can restore us. That the gospel is about making all things new, including us.